Well, I have this picture. I have this picture of our family Christmas when I was 5 years old, and my brother and I are in the picture. We are sitting in the floor, and we are playing with some toys, something that Santa had brought us. And by the way, I believe. All right. So don't try to break the myth to me. All right. I'm not going there. Okay. What's really important is not noticeable is not so much what we are playing with, but what we aren't playing with. Because what we aren't playing with is the secret agent spy kit that is sitting somewhat secretly in the corner. Now, we had really wanted the secret agent spy kit. I mean, I remember like looking at it in the catalog and going like, okay, I am just this far from being a secret agent spy, complete with disappearing ink. But the truth of it is that I don't really remember a lot about playing with that secret agent spy kit. My thrill in it, my satisfaction level of the amount of fun that it brought to my life, and by the way, I never became that secret agent spy, all those disappeared about as fast as the disappearing ink did, if you know what I'm saying. I get this feeling that probably all of us, probably you have a secret agent spy kit story in your life, right? That's something that you just really, really wanted. I mean, something that you not only wanted, but you chased hard. I mean, you locked in, you saved for it, you put time into it, you thought about it, you finagled, you manipulated, whatever you need to do. You chased hard, and then you got it. And then maybe kind of like ours, you found it sitting in the corner. Sometimes those secret agent spy kit stories come to our life when we're 5, but sometimes they come when we're 15. Sometimes they come when we're 25 and 45 and even 60, right? We want something. We see it. We want it. We're convinced life will be better, and we spend a lot of time chasing it and pursuing that only to get it and find, nah. Or maybe your story is more of a more story. More that you have something and you just thought, hey, if I get that promotion, man, I'm there. Get that bonus, there. Get that vacation, get that increase in salary. Maybe some of you thought, maybe when I get married, life, man, then it's all going to come together, right? It's going to be everything I dreamed of. So marriage ends up being, so we go for the kid thing. We'll have children. That will be fulfilling to me. That'll be satisfying. And then we find out, as good as it is, maybe it's not exactly what we thought it would be. Well, we're spending the next 2 weeks in a series I just called Take a Hard Look. It's in the book of Haggai. Where is Haggai? Well, let me help you out a little bit. Haggai is between the books Zephaniah and Zechariah. You good with that? And I'm just going to admit to you that if you'd have looked in my Haggai, like my last several Bibles before I finally realized that the minor prophets actually were in God's Word, like a lot of my Bible would have been marked up, and Haggai would have been very clean, pressed, white pages, okay? The book of Haggai is a short little book. It's a short little book, 2 chapters, but it's really a powerful little book. And so what I want to do is just take a moment before we jump into this. I wanted just to build a little bit of ramp for you. You have some notes there if you want to follow along. That kind of backing up a little bit, in the 4th year of King Solomon, king over Judah, Solomon was David's son, Solomon builds his temple. And it's this magnificent, incredibly beautiful, powerful temple there in the middle of Jerusalem. It becomes the object of the people's desire. It was their place of worship. Much of their life centered around the temple. A few years later, in 587 BC, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, comes in and he destroys Jerusalem. He destroys the temple, all right? And basically just wreaks havoc on Judah and God's people. And also in doing that, he takes God's people and he moves them into exile back to Babylon. Now, we talk about the exile kind of like we talk about going to come and go sometimes, like, oh yeah, and then people were exiled. But listen, this would be like a foreign country threatening us with the point of nuclear war, to the point where we knew they were going to push the button, and it paralyzed us, and that we became completely under their control, maybe even moved to their country. We would lose all the liberties and all the freedoms that we have. We would be foreigners in a strange land. This exile was a big thing. And the people were there because they had been disobedient. And they were there about 50 years of 70. There were different times that they came back. But essentially in 538, the exiles were returned to the land that God had promised, the land that they had been taken from. But again, Jerusalem is destroyed and the temple is destroyed. And the response was that the heartfelt gratitude. They were like, oh, we're back. We're back. They were sad about the temple being destroyed. They rebuilt the altar of the temple. But then they became distracted. And so about 18 years later, in 520 BC, this man named Haggai comes into the picture. We don't know much about him. We only know what Haggai tells us, that in Haggai 1:1, it says this. Basically, this is in 520 BC, 18 years after they have returned from Babylonia. On August 29th of the second year of King Darius' reign, the Lord gave a message to the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel. We're going to stop and just say thank you to our moms and dads for not naming us Zerubbabel. All right? Okay, Ross, call your mom and dad. Say, Mom and Dad, thanks for not naming me Zerubbabel. Okay? Be a tough one to go to kindergarten with. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Jeshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord of Heaven's army says. It's important that we know that this is something from God. This is not a government leader just saying this. This is not even Haggai. This is God speaking through Haggai. The people are saying the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. The time has not yet come. Okay? Now this is very interesting because most of the time when God talks about his people, he says, my children. Or he says, my kids. Or he says, God's people. But in this situation, he says, these people. Husbands, have you ever come home from work and your wife says something like this? Honey, how was your day? And she says, well, your kids have been doing, and she, decides to spend the next 30 minutes telling you what your kids have done. That's kind of like this. And you kind of want to respond, well, I think you were there when this whole thing started. But when things go bad, the blame begins, and it's like a little bit like God doesn't want to really have any part of necessarily of that these are his kids. He's just kind of tired of this behavior. So what they say is the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. At face value, that sounds like, okay, they've thought carefully through this. They've got a plan for the future. They're just waiting for the time to be right. One of our elders, Jerry Huffer, told me years ago, we were talking about people that don't show up, people who give excuses. And he said, Steve, he said, when you ask a person a question, he said, they'll give you the reason, and then there's the real reason. You know what I'm talking about, right? This is the former, not the latter. It's not yet come. This is not a well thought through plan. This is not them having God's best interest in mind. And God knows it. And God won't put up with that. And so he responds, basically, God's response is this. He asks them a hard question. In Haggai 1:4, he says this, why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? Let's just say together, 1, 2, 3, ouch. 1, 2, 3, ouch. Okay? God doesn't put up with it's just not time yet. God knows that's a lie. God knows that they are not being truthful with him or with themselves in this situation. Why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruin? He doesn't spiritualize this. He just sets this incredible contrast, letting the people see, okay, hey, listen, you're building your fine houses. The funny thing actually is that in the Hebrew, what he says is you are building your paneled houses. Anybody grow up with paneling? Yeah, I mean, like at the time, like, hey, we're going to get paneling. Okay? Pretty swanky, huh? All right? Not so much anymore. What are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out how to get the paneling down, how to paint over the paneling, whatever, okay? But they were building houses with paneling at the time. At that point in time, 500 years before Jesus came, paneling was in. All right? It may come back. You are building fine houses. See, the chief surgeon desires truth, and when the chief surgeon steps into surgery, he does not bring a dull knife. He doesn't spiritualize this. He didn't give them any wiggle room. He says, listen, here's what's happening. You are building your fine houses, and my house is laying there, continues to be demolished after almost 20 years. Hard question. Hard question for us to think about sometimes. Now, let me make this clear for us, all right? We are not talking about buildings here. We're really not talking about buildings, although we're kind of talking about buildings. This is not about us building this is not really about us building fine houses. This is about us. The people of God, then, and you and I. This is about our hearts. This is about what we are pursuing and where we are putting our time and what our lives are about. This is about whether you and I, on a regular and daily basis, are inviting the presence of God into our lives. Whether we are about what God desires for us and what he has for us, or whether we are trying to run the show ourselves. Now, while we're talking about buildings for just a second, I just remind you that from the very, very beginning, when God brought his people out of Egypt, they weren't out there very long before he gave incredible instructions to Moses. 5 chapters of incredibly melancholic, detailed instructions. Wears me plumb out to read it, okay? But why? Because he wanted it to be a thing of perfection. And what was that for? It was a tabernacle. It was a tent made of the finest things they had at that point in time, made by the finest craftsmen. And why was that? It was the tent of his presence. And I realized that when I looked at an image of this, okay, that tabernacle, you know where it was amongst the people? It was right smack dab in the middle of camp, not to the edge somewhere. There were 3 tribes on one side, 3 tribes encamped on one, 3 tribes encamped on the one side, and 3 camps and tribes on the last side. It was right smack dab in the middle. And the glory of God, it says, fill the temple, his presence. And the cloud was over the temple. And when it was time for the move, what happened? The cloud lifted and it went ahead and guided them. And every morning when they woke up and they began starting their fires, what was there in their vision? What they saw was the tabernacle, the symbolic tent of God's presence. It reminded them who they were. It reminded them who he was. It reminded them who was in authority. It reminded them where they were going. It reminded them why they lived. Constant presence. And years later, when Solomon built the temple and he built it high on the hill in Jerusalem, people from all around and everywhere in Jerusalem could wake up in the morning and they could see the beautiful temple and they could be reminded again, God is present with us. And everything he has for us is there. We don't have to strain and we don't have to strive and we don't have to try to be satisfied with all these other things. He is there. And his authority and his peace is over us. It's not time yet. the people say. It's not time. Let me just make sure we understand this. Most of the history of Israel, God's children, most of the time, are they obedient? Help me out. No. They are incredible, disobedient people. Most of the time, they are literally caught up in the same idolatry of the countries around them. And I read the other day again in Deuteronomy, the surrounding nations are actually sacrificing their children and on the fire. And God's children actually participated in this. They were building Asherah poles. They were involved in idolatry and immorality of the most sordid kind. But that's not going on here. That's not going on here. They are giving lip service to God. They're where they're supposed to be most of the time. There's not this high level of disobedience, immorality. They've just been back from exile 20 years. It's just not time to build God's temple, they say. Not that we won't. We're not interested in that. No, we'll get to it. It's just not time. And there's a lot of times in our lives as believers that we're not involved in incredible immorality. We're not worshiping other gods as such. We just grow complacent, right? We just begin to get a little confident and we begin to do things on our own where the day before or the day before that we are previously surrounding ourselves with God's presence and leaning into Him. Listen, God's own children, His own children's failure to rebuild the temple was tantamount to them saying, my brothers and sisters, you are not welcome here. Their failure to rebuild the temple at the time when they were supposed to be rebuilding the temple, that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing, was them saying to God, we don't need your presence. God had asked him a hard question. Now he asked him in Haggai 1:5. In verse 5 he says, take a hard look. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies say. Look at what's happening to you. Look at what's happening to you. Another version actually says, take a hard look. 1:6, you have planted much, but harvest little. This is at the first harvest time, by the way. They would have just been harvesting the very, very first harvest. And he says, look at what's happening to you. Look hard. Examine. Look at your excuse you just told me. Is that really the truth? Are you really waiting for the time? Or are you just caught up in your own life? You have planted much but harvest little. You eat but are not satisfied. You drink but are still thirsty. You put on clothes but you cannot keep warm. And your wages disappear as though you were putting them in pockets filled with holes. Isn't that a great picture? See, God challenges you and I. He challenges us today to take a hard look at what we are placing in the God-shaped hole of our heart. Pockets filled with holes. You ever had pockets filled with holes before? I was walking somewhere the other day, and I'm walking down, and I take my car keys, and I put them in the hole. I put them in my pocket, and I take about 4, and I hear this chink, and I just keep going. I'm like, oh, crud. And I turn around, and the keys are in the parking lot, and then there's coins in front of that, Pockets filled with holes. It's just this incredible, kind of a fun picture in some ways, if it wasn't so serious, of us trying to save, of us trying to collect, of us thinking we've got everything we need, and as we're doing it, it's just falling out on the floor beyond our control. Hey, let me ask you, what's wrong with planting? You plant, but you harvest little. What's wrong with planting? Not a doggone thing. What's wrong with eating? Not a doggone thing. What's wrong with drinking? Not a doggone thing. What's wrong with putting on clothes? Not a doggone thing. The problem is this. They are doing it with no thought of what God's desire for their life is. And when they get it, they will be the one who get the glory They will not rebuild the temple. They're doing well on their own. Thank you very much. Building the temple, folks, for you and I means that we place him where he desires and he deserves to be. God says this again. Look. I mean, look at what you're doing. Take a hard look. And it's not spiritualized here. This is kind of an interesting thing. He asked this hard question. He asked them to take a hard look, to really examine it. And there's no, okay, so we're looking. God, what do you want us to do? And this is really interesting. There's no spiritualization there. He doesn't say, oh, you don't have me in the right place in your life. You care more about that than you do. He doesn't do that. Here's what he says. Take a hard right. Look at 1:8. Now go up into the hills and bring down timber and rebuild my house. Isn't that a kind of a crazy response? He asked him a hard question. He asked him to take a hard look. And when there's with the realization of, hey, when they realize, okay, that, hey, they really are not telling the God the truth, that there really are places they are trying to put things in the God-shaped hole of their life. What do you want me to do about it, God? He doesn't say pray. He doesn't say, think about this real hard. He says, do this. Go up into the hills and cut the trees down and start building my house. As a matter of fact, this interesting thing, he says, now. A couple years ago, actually several now, we were in this staff meeting, and it's actually James, at a time when James had gone to another church for a couple of years and then returned. But at the time, one of our elders was in the church and was in the meeting. And so we were talking about some things that need to be done. And he asked that one of our secretaries, he said, hey, this needs to be done. And she said, okay, and she wrote it down. And then he said, no, I mean now. And so she kind of looked up and she walked off, and then I was thinking to myself, that really doesn't need to be now. It's what we call the lion personality. And if you have a lion, if you is a lion, if you know a lion, lions use the word now a lot. There is no later. If it needs to be done, it needs to be done now. And now it's actually late because it should have been done yesterday. They like the word now. Listen, God's got some lion in him, folks. And there's some times he just says now, and this is one of them. He says, listen, he says, you are spending your time and your energy and your hearts in the wrong place. Now go. And go implies that they have to stop something, which is probably building their fine houses. And he just says, you need to do this right now. I'm just saying, actually Haggai is saying this. When we are truthful with ourselves and we realize that we are placing something in the God-shaped hole of our life, when we are living with ourselves in control instead of God being in control, when we are doing it on our own, when we recognize that, it is no time for navel-gazing, folks. The time to change is today, that we begin to make those changes. God says, go. Go up the hill, cut the timber, come down, rebuild my house. Not an easy thing. Going up in the hills wouldn't have been easy. Cutting the timber down. I'm not saying this is easy, but he does make it simple. He doesn't leave any questions on this, right? I got this phone call last weekend from this young man that I've known literally since he was born. Did his wedding a number of years ago. Last weekend, he did something really stupid. Very, very harmful to his marriage. So he called me and said, Steve, what do I do? And sometimes I'm tempted to do what my dad used to call pussyfooting, basically, which means kind of tiptoeing around. And I thought, you know what? This is no time for that. So I said, here's what you need to do. Here's some things you do not need to do, and here's some things you need to do. And you know what? That young guy did exactly what I asked him to do. And there were some difficult things I asked him to do. They were being awkward. And I told him this was going to be awkward. I said, you're going to want to do this because it's going to feel better. But this is what you need to do because this is going to heal better. And he's called me along the way and said, I've got that taken care of. I did this day. And he said it was awkward, but it got better. Folks, there's a time when God just says, now, quit messing around. No time to think about it anymore. You don't have to pray about it anymore. You were doing this. You just need to change. And then God lays on them a really hard truth. Hard question. Hard look. Now he's going to lay this very, very hard truth. 9 to 11. You hope for rich harvest, but they were poor. And when you brought your harvest home, I blew it away. Why? Because my house lies in ruins, says the Lord of heaven's own armies, while all of you are busy building your own fine houses. It's because of you that the heavens withhold the dew and the earth produces no crops. I have called for a drought on your fields and hills, a drought to wither the grain and grapes and olive trees and all your other crops, a drought to starve you and your livestock and to ruin everything, catch this, you have worked so hard to get. Whew. I blew it away. Now, folks, you've got to make sure in the next couple minutes that you're hearing what I'm saying. Don't think you hear what I'm saying. You've got to hear what I'm saying. I realize, as I'm preparing this sermon, that this week we have people in our community right here at Boulevard and in our community, and you know them and you've been directly affected in some way by the flood and tornadoes. Homes are underwater, jobs are lost, people can't get to their jobs. I mean, there's all those things. Please keep in mind. Please keep in mind that I started preparing this sermon. It was actually, we decided to do this 8 months ago, that on this date we would cover this passage. And I am not saying that those people who have been devastated in so many ways and homes taken, that they are suffering the punishment of God. I am not saying that. We just have to read this and know that at times what God is saying is when our lives, when we are declaring ourselves Lord, when we are trying to consistently place things in our heart that will never satisfy, that God will do what is necessary to get our attention. And the word is clear. It rains on the just and the unjust. So maybe there are people there who have been devastated, who need this, who need this awakening spiritually so they can find God in a way they have never found. But does that mean that everybody's in that situation? No. That is not what God is saying. That is not, it doesn't matter what I'm saying. It's not what God is saying here. Why, though? Why would he blow it away? Because he says, you are busy building your own fine houses. What are we busy with? What are you chasing? What's your secret agent spy kit that you want so bad and you've been putting so much energy to your thing, and you're just thinking, if only I had that, only I had him, if only I had her, if only I had that, life would be good. And God says, even if you get it, I may blow it away. Because why? Because he's mean? No. Because he is a jealous God. And folks, he knows himself because he is God, that there is nothing that you and I will ever put in that God-shaped hole in our heart that will bring satisfaction for more than just a couple moments. And we can try, and we can chase, and we can pursue, and it will not satisfy. And God would be the meanest of gods if he allowed us to spend our life continually until the day they put us in a coffin trying to fill our hearts with those things. Instead, he steps in a very, very harsh way sometimes out of his deep love for us and says, you don't get it, so I'm going to pull the trigger. I'm going to make it really tough until you look up and realize that hole in your heart is God-shaped. It is my shape, and only I will bring the satisfaction. What are we building? A number of years ago, a number of years ago, actually, Dawn and I were just watching this show, actually, just the other day. And in this show, this husband and wife are having this conversation. And he makes a comment that somehow leads her to believe that there was another girl who broke his heart. And so she pushes him. You know, she just keeps on, hey, just tell me and it'll be okay. Just tell me it'll be okay. And he resists, you know. He resists, and she keeps pushing. So finally he goes, okay, you know, it was Ruth Ann. Ruth Ann! And she just lets him have it. See, God has created a little marriage moment here for you. God's created women to want the full heart of a man. Now, I'm not talking about other than Jesus, but I'm talking other than Jesus being in our heart. A woman wants our full heart, right? And a woman has this intuitiveness placed in her by God that she knows, men, when she has our full heart, and when we are pouring part of our heart out towards other people or things. And the God who made women to know when they have our full heart, he knows also when he has your full heart and when he has our full heart, or when we're just making excuses and building our own houses. So maybe you're trying to put a vacation in there. Nothing wrong with vacation, nothing wrong with vacation. Vacation can be an amazing Sabbath rest for us, but if we're trying to fill that hole in our heart with vacation to bring us what God can only bring us, you may be single. You may be giving yourself away in sexual intimacy without the real intimacy time and time again because you believe that intimacy will somehow fill and satisfy and make you feel meaningful and purposeful. You may be longing for security, and you're doing all kinds of things to bring that security to help you feel better. And let me just say that there are times that God may not change your situation, friends, or he may cause pain so he can change your heart. He is a severely jealous God because he is an all deeply loving God. And he will do whatever is necessary. He will do whatever is necessary. Well, there's this amazing invitation here. And it's actually amazing and it's cool and it's rare because most of the time when you see God's children getting a message from God, even when it's very, very direct, even more so direct than this sometimes, usually they just keep on disobeying. But in Haggai 1:12 it says, "Then Zerubbabel of Shealtiel and Jeshua son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of God's people began to obey the message from the Lord their God. And when they heard the words of the prophet Haggai, whom the Lord their God had sent, the people feared the Lord." The people they laid down their tools at their homes, and they went up the hill, and they cut down the timber, and they began to rebuild the temple. And God says, catch this. See, I told you this wasn't about buildings. They haven't even really actually started rebuilding yet. But when God sees their response of recognizing that they are wrong and that He is right and that they are going to begin to put Him in that God-shaped hole, guess what God says? I am with you. Even before that temple is built, He promises His presence because they are inviting Him into their life. They are saying, it is only you who will fill this. And He says, I am with you. And folks, listen, God's not waiting for you to make a better life. He's not about making your life better. And He's not waiting for you to make a better life before you come to Him. He's just about us laying down the tools that are building. We are doing to build whatever we're building, and coming and cutting the timber and coming down and rebuilding, inviting His presence into our life. And look what He brings. It's this really weird thing. He says He actually sparked the enthusiasm of the people. Sometimes we don't desire what God desires. We just have to go to God and say, God, I'm caught up in this stuff. I'm caught up in this relationship. I'm caught up with this money. I know you probably have what is right for me, but I really still want this stuff. And it says in the sense that God sparks the desire. He will cause you to want Him if you will only be honest with Him. What fine house are you building? What excuses are we making as we do what we are doing, building what we are building, working so hard to get? What are you putting in pockets with holes? Hoping for that satisfaction? What's your secret agent spy kit with disappearing ink? We need to stop. We need to go up the hill. We need to realize that there's a God who alone satisfies. David says, your presence is joy. Your presence is joy. Not burdensome. He doesn't ruin the party. He doesn't have bad things planned for you. He has good things planned for you. Let's ask Him to be present in our lives so we can be under the authority of His grace and understand and sense His peace. So we can know His rule for our life and sense and have His love. Let's stop rebuilding or stop building what we're building and ask for His presence. Everything that He has that comes with that presence.